This is a moment of Israeli life and culture. My name is Ben Bresky. Karen Guth has been a teacher in Israel for the past 20 years. She has just released her latest children's book entitled Wow, a children's prayer of wonder and gratitude, which was inspired by a trip with her Haredi grandchildren to the Jerusalem Zoo. Karen speaks about her inspiration to leave Denver, Colorado and move to Efrat, Israel during the Second Intifada. Find out how her children felt and where they are now, and how Corona has affected her newfound career as a children's book author.
I was a Jewish day school educator for several years, and I said to my students, I used to teach Jewish history and Tanakh and literature. I taught on both sides of the curriculum. And I said to my students one day, I've been teaching Jewish history, and now it's time for us, my family and I, to make Jewish history. And the only place that my husband and I felt that we could make Jewish history was in the Jewish state. It took us about a year. We went on a trip beforehand to look at places and look at schools for our boys were older, 15 and 11, when we made Aliyah. That was it. We decided rather than to be fans in the stand, because we were supportive of the state of Israel and Denver, that it was time to be out on the playing field.
Karen's grandmother, born in Russia, was very active with Hadassah, the women's Zionist organization. Her grandfather was born in Mezhebish, the hometown of the Baal Shem Tov, founder of the Hasidic movement.
My grandfather was the founder of the Colorado Zionist organization. He was born in Mezhebish, the same place that the Baal Shem Tov lived. Also, my grandmother, before they met, came from Russia. And my mother was involved all her life in Hadassah, the Women's Zionist organization, and was in the Hadassah organization. And so we were raised believing that the state of Israel is the Jewish state and that Jews who were serious about supporting the Jewish state would eventually, if they could, move here. My grandfather sort of rejected his religious upbringing and became more of a secular Zionist, much to the chagrin of his father, but always believed in the Jewish state and supported it. He was a lawyer by trade, but he used to teach in the Jewish schools. I actually started teaching. My first teaching job was assisting him in the Jewish afternoon schools.
After making Aliyah, Karen found work as a teacher and English coordinator at Yeshivat Makor Chaim, the high school founded by Rabbi Aiden Steinsaltz in Kfar Etzion, and at Ulpana Rosh Surim Girls High School, jobs she has held now for over 20 years.
The first year was really a year to get organized and try to get our kids organized. And Eric was traveling. He had a job for an Israeli company, but he was going back and forth to the States and to Israel. And so I didn't teach that year. And then a couple years later, I taught chugim. I taught these small groups in my home privately to help children improve their English. And then I'm a swimmer. So one day in the swimming pool, someone approached me and said, would you like to teach English in the high schools here in Israel? And I said, I'm kind of afraid to teach in Israeli high schools. I hear the discipline isn't so great. So it turned out she gave me a very nice job at Yeshivat Makor Chaim teaching 9th grade English speakers. And they were fabulous and I loved them. And I've been teaching there ever since. And I also teach at the Ulpana Rosh Surim, which is one of the high schools for girls. My discipline problems are trying to keep them awake in the afternoon because the boys only learn English in the afternoon, and the girls are lovely girls, and I have the best students in Israel. I always get the best students wherever I am.
Back in the early 2000s, Efrat was much smaller, and the Guths have enjoyed watching the community, which is estimated to have about 10% English speakers, add more neighborhoods over the years.
We came to Efrat before the neighborhoods of the Dagan and the Tamar were built. The Zayat was just being built, the 7 hills of Efrat. Maybe 10% of the population are English speakers. Now, that doesn't mean they're all from English-speaking countries. We have a lot of Israelis who lived abroad and came to Efrat. The quality of life here is quite good. And the educational systems, the schools were quite good. And that was really what drew us here, plus the beautiful views. When you're not stuck in traffic, we're really about 15, 20 minutes away from Jerusalem. So that was also appealing to us.
As for her sons, she is proud of both of them. Now those 2 boys, raised in a modern Orthodox religious Zionist community, have fully integrated into Israeli society, but on different paths. One is married with children, living as a Haredi Jew in Jerusalem's Mea Shearim neighborhood.
Our oldest lives in Mea Shearim with his wife and 6 children. Their Rebbe believes that all Jews should be in Israel, and Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And our youngest son is in Tel Aviv. He's a musician. He's a believing Jew. Yes, they both took different directions, but, they're both here. So that's also important to us. You raise your children, but just like my husband and I chose a different path from our parents, we have to expect that our children will grow up and choose their own paths. Again, they're both living here, and there's a place for everyone in Israel, whatever Jewish group, or whether you're secular or Orthodox or conservative or Reform, you're welcome here in Israel. When Corona hit, our youngest son was in New York, and he called us and said, please bring me back to Israel. And he's been here ever since. Advice for people, I think you have to come here. We told our children, we're going on an adventure. We would be remiss if we didn't give our children the opportunity to experience life as a citizen in the state of Israel. And then we told them when they grew up, they would decide where they chose to live. But they're both fluent Hebrew speakers. Our son in Mea Shearim actually speaks Yiddish to his children. And our grandchildren are trilingual. So it's all good.
Karen Guth's life as a grandmother to Yiddish-speaking Haredi kids prompted her to release 2 children's books and maintain a blog for kids' stories that are acceptable to parents from both Orthodox and secular backgrounds.
This is the second book that I've published. The first, of course, was Bubi and Bidud, which was Savtas in Isolation, that came out in Hebrew and English. And this is a different book. This is a book about the wonder and gratitude that a child feels for the world that God has created for us. And really the inspiration for all my writing, I write children's stories on a blog called Tell Me a Story, Bubi, are my grandchildren. We had the opportunity to take them to the zoo for the first time ever, and to see their faces and experience their excitement, and everything was wow. And I thought to myself, I wrote a story about taking them to the zoo, and then I thought, this is a book I had considered writing several years ago for young children, but I was originally going to call it Hallelujah. The experience with the kids at the zoo. And then also I took this course with Rav Dov Zinger, who's the head of the Yeshivat Makor Chaim program and the whole yeshiva and all of its programs. And he talks about the wow in the world and how we have to not take it for granted. And so in this book, I think children naturally have a curiosity, and they naturally are awed by what they see, especially when it's new. And as we get older, we take things for granted, the views for granted, the animals for granted, the weather for granted. And children help us renew that excitement and awe. And so that's how this book came about. And of course, I'm very fortunate. I have a wonderful illustrator. I used her also with the Boobies and Bidud, Maytal Moore. She's just fabulous. She really created spectacular illustrations to the simple words of the text. So Maytal and I worked together when she was 12 years old. She wasn't one of my students, but we did a few series for Gush Etzion on children wrote creative pieces on when we were having the Intifada here. And the expulsion from Gush Katif also, the children, we gave them opportunities. I went to different schools and worked with English teachers and gave the students opportunity to express their feelings in poetry or free verse. And they wrote about what they were feeling, and anything from sadness to hope and fear. And Maytal illustrated those books, made the illustration for those books when she was 12. And then later on, when I wanted to do Booby and Bidud, I called her mom up and said, is she still illustrating? She said, yes, she has her own business. She's an illustrator. She also is a cello player, an excellent cello player, and teaches cello. And then for the translations, Michal Yechieli was a former student of mine at the Opana, and she now has a business of translating. And so she has a skill to translate and maintain the rhyme and the beat of the words, which is so important in children's free verse literature. A couple years ago, when the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Dov, whose course I was in, came back from New York, he unfortunately was tested positive for corona. And at that point, if there were more than 2 people in the place you worked, all of the workers had to go into isolation. So I went into isolation. All my students went into isolation. I actually had the students, we did a PowerPoint presentation where they took pictures of themselves in isolation, and they wrote in both English and Hebrew what I learned about myself in Bidud, in isolation. And it was quite moving and beautiful. So I like to encourage young people to write. I enjoy writing. My students write all the time. And I think that's part of what it means to be human, is to express yourself, whether it's in the arts, in writing, in singing, in artwork, and creativity. So WOW is just another example of that kind of collaborative working together with an artist and a writer and a translator. And wonderful things came from it. And all the kids who read it love it. I have pictures on my blog of kids reading it and grandparents and parents reading the book to them.
Karen Guth's books are available at Pomerantz Booksellers, Mincer Books, and on Amazon. Her storytelling website is tellmeastorybubby.com. That's tellmeastorybubie.com. This is Benjamin Bresky. Thank you for listening, and shalom.